Ice ages are real. This fact is demonstrable. We have measurable, credible, historic evidence. The dynamics of the principles that cause the ice ages are likewise demonstrable, with measurable, credibly knowable, and scientifically provable, tangible evidence. It is also demonstrable that ice ages are not a scourge. While they require humanity to upgrade its world enormously because of the dramatic new climate conditions that an ice age brings with it, the ice ages contribute to the development of mankind with conditions that only ice age environments can provide. While an ice age epoch is somewhat inconvenient for human living, as it requires extreme worldwide cooperation to protect the global food supply, the inconveniences promise to be insignificant in comparison with what we stand to benefit. This means that the start of the next ice age, that is possibly as near as the 2050s, or nearer, shouldn't inspire gloom but inspire celebration, as a new cultural and scientific renaissance will unfold on the path of meeting the ice age challenge as we relocate much of the world's agriculture from the endangered areas into the tropics. For the lack of land in the tropics, we'll place our agriculture afloat across the equatorial seas. We will do all of this, partly because it is necessary to maintain our food supply, for which agriculture is the foundation. But more than this, we will do it because it is the human thing to do to develop new worlds with ever greater potential. And we will come out richer by this process. The materials, energy resources, and technologies for this gigantic project already exist. As a part of the project, we will create 6,000 to 8,000 brand new cities that are required when the traditional areas located above the 40-degree latitudes become uninhabitable, which includes in the northern hemisphere all of Canada, Europe, Russia, and parts of China, and parts of the USA. Many of the thousands of new cities will be placed afloat onto the seas, together with the floating agriculture, industries, even forests. The giant project promises a revolutionary explosion of good for humanity by its own creating. However, the big benefits that we will gain with the ice age transition lie not in what we can yet imagine, such as building a brand new world. The benefits lay far beyond the presently imaginable. This greater benefit is rooted in the nature of the ice age dynamics. The Great Ice Age benefits. Ice ages result from the confluence of a number of electromagnetic conditions. These conditions temporarily interrupt the powering of our sun, as an electric star with plasma interactions occurring on its surface. The interruptions are such that the sun goes inactive. It no longer produces thermal and light energy, but merely emits whatever residual energy it has stored up. This means that the sun's energy radiation will diminish by 70% to a mere 30% of the present intensity. This also means that the sun will then no longer emit solar winds, so that solar winds no longer form a heliosphere around the solar system, which presently shields us to some degree from the galactic cosmic ray intrusions. When the shielding by the heliosphere is gone, the galactic cosmic ray flux reaching the Earth will likely increase threefold. The increase has already begun. In a great ice age environment, under an inactive sun, much of the shielding of the Earth from galactic cosmic ray flux will no longer exist. The cosmic rays that shower everything on Earth will then be more energetic and more numerous. Each person on Earth is presently bombarded with 50,000 cosmic rays per day. Cosmic rays are not rays in the common sense, but are fast-moving individual electrons and protons. Since the particles carry an electric charge, they pass right through the human body, without touching anything, being repelled by the electric force. Our body is made of atoms. Atoms are dynamic physical structures that are more than 100,000 times larger than the parts they are made of. This means that an atom is largely empty space. It is extremely rare, therefore, that cosmic ray particles impact with anything as they pass through the body. Nevertheless, the cosmic ray particles carry an electric charge, and, as they pass through the body, their energetic movement creates a magnetic field around them which does affect the body. The fast-moving magnetic field generates an electric current in the surrounding tissue, as the electric plasma particle flows through the body. The induced electric currents seem to have a beneficial effect, since the human body has large neurological networks that pervade every part of it, especially in the brain, and considering that these networks operate electrically, the small amounts of cosmic ray-induced electricity appears to have a beneficial effect. The threefold increase of this effect during Ice Age conditions appears to have a dramatic beneficial effect on cognitive development. Evidence along this line suggests that the development of the human being might not have been possible without this beneficial effect. It may have been for this reason that the development of humanity coincides with one of the severest Ice Age epochs in the history of life on our planet, in which the sun would be inactive for long periods, with correspondingly stronger cosmic ray showers. The only comparable previous ice epoch occurred roughly 450 million years ago. That's when the complexity of life on our planet took a big leap forward, with a vast development of life to follow. The dawn of humanity represents another big leap forward in the development of life on this planet. It began a giant leap in cognitive functions that sets humanity apart as a completely new manifest of life, with an intellectual quality that had never existed before, nor been possible before. The large increase in cosmic ray flux that occurred during the long Ice Age epoch in which human development occurred may be the reason for our very existing today. We are literally the children of the Ice Ages. By exploring the historic ice deposits in Antarctica, which take us back in time more than 500,000 years, it becomes apparent that for 85% of the existence of humanity the Earth was gripped by glaciation conditions when the sun was inactive. This means that the normal climate on Earth, since the dawn of man, has been the Ice Age glaciation climate. That's what we are about to get back into. The pleasantly warm interglacial periods that are wedged between the large glacial periods are in the longer sweep of time, short climate anomalies. They cover only 15% of the overall time frame. The present climate is an anomaly, with a new night looming before us. We should have celebrated the present anomaly in which our civilization developed, which gave rise to remarkable cultures and a world population of 7 billion people. Instead, we have developed war, terror, looting, slavery, and now we even cry for depopulation. We have even prepared the stage for nuclear war that would likely assure our extinction. The trek to tragedy, insanity, and inhumanity leaves one to wonder if a celebration of our interglacial holiday would actually be warranted. It seems we have suffered enormous losses on the humanist scale during our nicely warm, good times. If one compares the Great Giza pyramids in Egypt, which were evidently built by a civilization that emerged from the last ice age, with the later pyramids built during the time of the pharaohs, an enormous mental regression comes to light. The earlier pyramids are incomparably superior in all aspects of design, precision of construction, celestial alignment, and so on. In comparison with the Giza pyramids, the later pyramids from the time of the pharaohs are primitive imitations. It appears that the cognitive power of humanity had been diminished during the intervening thousands of years between the two building projects. The early builders had produced monuments of great quality and ingenuity that are counted among the wonders of the world. Their achievement would be natural for a culture that had come out of the cosmic ray-rich times. In comparison, the product of the later cultures, the cultures of the cosmic ray-starved time, would by the ongoing regression have been monuments of mediocrity, which they are. The pattern of great achievements, coinciding with periods of increased cosmic ray flux, is supported by numerous types evidence. We find that many great cultural achievements were wrought in times of exceptional cold times during the current interglacial period. Cold periods result from diminished solar winds that weaken the heliosphere and enable increased cosmic ray flux to reach the Earth. This means that exceptional cold periods are exceptionally rich in cosmic ray nourishment. The cold climates result as a consequence of increased cosmic ray flux. The increase increases cloudiness on Earth. It has been experimentally verified with the cloud experiment at the CER and labs in Europe that cosmic ray-induced ionization dramatically increases the water vapor nucleation that forms clouds. The increase in aerosol nucleation went straight up and off the chart when artificial cosmic rays were added during the experiment. On the global scale, increased cloudiness reflects a greater portion of the incoming solar radiation back into space, which thereby is lost to the heat budget on Earth, so that the Earth gets colder. This means that historic cold periods were periods of greater cosmic ray flux density. It is not surprising, therefore, that the greatest scientific and cultural developments occurred during these cold periods. The fall of Rome and the rise of Islam and the Islamic Renaissance occurred during a deep cold period. Inversely, all the horrible periods in history occurred during the great warm peaks. The Minoan warming coincides with the Vedic and Brahmanic Dark Age in India. In the same manner, the Roman warming coincides with the rise of Rome that nearly destroyed civilization. And the medieval warming coincides with the Dark Age period of utter political insanity and inhumanity. And later again, during the deep cold of the Little Ice Age, centered on the Maunder minimum in solar activity, all of the great geniuses emerged that had ushered in the scientific era, from Kepler to Gauss, and in music from Bach to Mozart and Beethoven. If these comparisons suggest a trend, then we can look forward to a lot of good things coming to the foreground, as we are moving deeper into the cosmic ray-rich era towards the next ice age. And more so when the Ice Age actually begins, which may be only 30 to 40 years away. It is uncertain, of course, if this trend is sufficient by itself to get the infrastructures built to protect our food supply, and to create a new world. The simple fact is that the new world must be built before the old world ends, which ends with the start of the next Ice Age, potentially in the 2050s. Let's review the Ice Age dynamics. Because there are numerous, interlocked issues involved in the arena of solar dynamics, and numerous illusions prevail about them, the exploration becomes somewhat lengthy, especially because many of the issues that are related to solar dynamics also include a wide-ranging complex of science. Furthermore, because of the critical nature of the Ice Age dynamics, and their immediate relevance for today's world, a high degree of certainty and understanding is required for the policies to be established for building the necessary infrastructures, especially when the heart of the challenge involves aspects that we cannot see. We cannot see with the eye what happens in the future, but we can see this with the mind by understanding the effects of principles and their manifestations and consequences. It is this seeing with the mind that we must trust sufficiently to place far-reaching policies on that we need to implement quickly, even when they involve future requirements, before they happen. That requires a lot from humanity to come to terms with. However, to fail would mean that we kill our children, and us with them, when the next Ice Age begins, and we are not ready for it. With this in mind, how do we begin to develop a sense of certainty? According to general perception, Ice Ages are rare, distant events, almost like dreams, that are too far removed from reality to be taken seriously. Some say that Ice Ages do not really happen. They say that Ice Ages are not possible from a scientific basis, according to the nature of the Sun, that is generally recognized as an invariable constant. Indeed, if the Sun would not change, what would cause the Ice Ages? It is well established and supported with volumes of evidence that Ice Ages do occur. We find the evidence in deep-sea sediments, as it is shown here, that Ice Ages have occurred for the last 2 million years, as far back as the dawn of man. And we find concurring evidence locked in the ice of Antarctica that covers only the last quarter of the Pleistocene, the modern ice epoch. All this means that we have a paradox to resolve. Under the theory of the constant sun, which is the currently accepted theory, the gigantic climate oscillations shown here are not possible. When ice sheets pile up over much of the northern continents, so massively that the ocean surface drops by more than 400 feet as the water is turned into ice, and winter sea ice extends as far south as Los Angeles, we are looking at giant effects that have an enormously large cause. Ice ages are not fringe events. since we are extremely close to the next round of these gigantic effects unfolding, it becomes imperative that the cause be understood sufficiently for the paradox to be resolved, in order that preparations can be made for the gigantic glaciation environments that now stand before us, potentially starting in the 2050s. In order to resolve the paradox quickly, one needs to ask whether the general perception is true, that the sun is an invariable constant. The plain evidence that we see before us refutes the general perception that the sun is an invariable star. The evidence and its meaning may be hard to accept, since the constant sun theory is so widely promoted that it has become effectively a doctrine. The general perception is that the sun is a sphere of atomic gas, mostly hydrogen, and some helium, and that within its core, at a calculated temperature of 15 million degrees Kelvin, at a gas density 150 times the density of water, nuclear fusion reactions do occur that generate vast amounts of energy, by which the sun becomes a brilliantly radiant sphere in the sky that has burnt for billions of years with unchanging intensity, and will keep on burning for a few more billion years to come. However, when the sun is regarded as a constant factor in the climate equation, with a supposedly unvarying energy output for all times, what then would cause the Ice Age phenomena that are known to have occurred, that we have physical evidence of? Under a constant sun, no cause would exist for continental ice sheets to form, much less to form more than 10,000 feet deep, in which so much water is laid up on land as ice that the ocean levels become lowered by 400 feet. These enormous effects require a corresponding cause. But where is the cause? One approach for solving the paradox has led to the search for theories that might possibly support the phenomena of ice ages under a constant sun day. This approach became known as the Milankovitch Cycles theory. The Milankovitch Cycles theory. There was a time when it appeared that a credible ice age theory is conceivable, even under the doctrine of the constant sun. It was theorized at the time that the known, slight variations over long periods of time of the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit around the Sun, and the tilt of its spin axis, and also the shifting of the orientation of its axis, would, if the cyclical variations were combined, create the needed conditions in which ice ages might occur. This theory was named the Milankovitch Cycles theory in honor of the Serbian geophysicist and astronomer Milutin Milankovitch, who has pioneered the theory. There was much talk, at the time, about computed variations of the exposure of the Earth to the Sun, by latitude and by season, referred to as measurements of insolation, or inversely, solar forcing, which were deemed to have such large effects that cyclical ice ages could occur. However, over time, the theory lost support, especially when it became apparent that the computed cycles of theorized solar exposure do not really match the known historic observations. For example, it became apparent that the actual climate trends that were measured in the ice in Antarctica were frequently off by tens of thousands of years from the computed values that are deemed to have caused them. The large difference suggests that the orbital variations were themselves secondary phenomena of the larger cause that causes the ice ages. In the green circle, the physically measured trend has lagged the assumed computed cause by as much as 20,000 years, in some cases, while in later times, in the orange circle, the measured trend preceded the computed cause by roughly 10,000 years. When events precede an assumed cause, the assumption for the cause is evidently wrong. Also, according to the computed values, the Earth should be in a deep ice age already that should have started thousands of years ago. The fact that this hasn't happened puts the Ice Age theory, based on orbital cycles variations, still further into doubt. The theory lost even more support when it became eventually recognized that the orbital variations that supposedly cause the ice ages only affect the seasonal and hemispheric distribution of the solar energy received, while the total amount of the energy that is received from the Sun remains the same in every case, regardless of how the Earth's spin axis is tilted and oriented, and its orbital eccentricity varies. It is far more rational, therefore, to assume that the minute orbital characteristics that have been detected are not the causative force of the ice ages at all, but are themselves merely fringe effects of the immense changes in the electromagnetic environment in the solar system that logically occur in ice age epochs, which are themselves the effect of much larger causes. When 400 feet of the ocean surface is laid up on land as continental ice sheets piled up more than 10,000 feet deep, and sea ice extends as far south as Los Angeles, then we have big causes at work for these gigantic effects. The known gigantic effects are inconsistent with a constant sun of unvarying intensity. Thus, the Milankovitch Cycles ice age theory, which is built on the constant sun theory, became effectively buried. However, with it being now buried, no real scientific basis remains standing to pin the ice age phenomena onto, under the heaven of a constant sun. This means that the sun is not a constant star at all, but is a highly variable star, and that some gigantic forces are at work that affect the action of our sun, by which the big ice ages do happen. But before we look at the dynamics of the changing sun, let's look at the evidence first that speaks loud and clear of the sun being a variable star. Hard evidence preserved in ice. Great volumes of evidence exist buried in the ice preserved from previous ice ages, which tell us unmistakably that ice ages are real, enormously extensive, and global in scale. And that's based on hard measurements. We find the hard measured evidence preserved in the ice in both the northern and southern hemisphere, and also in seabed sediment strata. The hard evidence has been measured at two major research sites in Antarctica, named Vostok and Ipica-Ordomsee, and at the opposite end of the Earth, at two major sites in Greenland, named Grip 2 and Ngrip. All the different measurements tell us essentially the same thing. They speak of deep ice ages that were globally extended. That the measurements are reliable is evidenced by the strong agreement that exists between the various measurements, even when different methods for measurement are used. Unfortunately, the historic ice does not yield direct temperature measurements. In the Greenland ice, the historic temperatures are deduced from measurements of the ratio between normal oxygen, found in the ice, and a rare isotope of oxygen, oxygen-18, that is heavier. The ratio between the two is known to be affected by the temperature of water at the time it was evaporated into clouds, and during the transport, before it became snow, that became ice. In Antarctica, which has so little snowfall, which is essentially an ice desert, a different ratio is used for the measurement. Instead of oxygen being measured, hydrogen is measured there. The measured ratio that is used in Antarctica is the difference between normal hydrogen trapped in the ice and the heavy isotope of hydrogen, named deuterium. Regardless of the different types of measurement, we see a strong agreement between all the measurements made, including those made in different hemispheres. The major difference between the Greenland ice and ice in Antarctica is that the Greenland ice gives us a much higher resolution of details. Ice is piled up in Greenland more than 10,000 feet deep, but it only takes us back in time 120,000 years. The ice in Antarctica, in comparison, which is slightly thicker and has thinner layers, takes us back more than 500 million years in time. However, with so much history being compacted, the accumulation lacks the fine details. It is safe to conclude, however, from these measurements, and from the global agreement between the various types of exploration sites, that ice ages are not a myth, that they are real, that for more than 85% of the last 500 million years, the Earth has been in an ice age environment. The ice exploration also tells us that the normal, deep glaciation that has been the Earth's climate for most of the last 2 million years gets periodically interrupted with nice warm interglacial climates like the one we are in right now, which appears to have run its course and is ending. Now, with this in mind, let's look at the sun and search for the type of solar effects that match the effects that we see. Hard evidence on the sun. And considering that the accepted constant sun theory is a myth, disputed by the Ice Age evidence, let's look for what is real. The stakes are far off the conventional track. In fact, the closer we look, we'll find that not a single item of tangible physical evidence exists that supports exclusively the theory that the sun is a sphere of atomic gas that is internally powered by a process of atomic nuclear fusion. All available evidence points away from this. The evidence tells us that the widely accepted theory about the sun is wrong. Just look at the sun and the sunspots. By looking through the umbra of the sunspots at what lies below them, we don't see the brilliant interior that we should see if the sun was internally powered by a nuclear furnace burning at its core. We see a sun that is dark below its shiny surface. Indeed, this is what we should see for a sun that is externally powered. Further evidence even tells us that the assumptions that the generally accepted theory is built on are not possible physically. Since the subject of the externally powered variable sun is a big subject by itself, I have created a special video for it. I am reviewing only a few highlights here, in which evidence presented in the video disputes the accepted solar theory and related theories. The accepted theory states that energy is produced in the core of the sun by atomic interaction under extreme temperature and pressure, by which hydrogen is fused into deuterium, then into helium-3, which is deemed to fuse into helium-4, in a long chain of theorized reactions. Laboratory experiments dispute this. In NASA-backed experiments, it took 1,000,000 times more energy to cause the helium-3 fusion to happen than the fusion result gave back. The inefficiency is inherent in the high ratio of protons to neutrons that doubles the proton's repelling force versus the kinetic energy in mass to overcome the repulsion. The helium-3 fusion is a nice fairy tale that's extremely hard to achieve, even by the sun. The Ice Age evidence itself disputes the internal fusion theory. The internal solar fusion theory envisions very long heat transfer times from the core of the sun to the surface. The envisioned convective heat transfer time has been estimated to be on the order of 30 million years. The energy travel time for photons from the core to the surface is said to be much shorter than this, in the range of 10,000 years to 170,000 years, which is still extremely long. The theorized, slow process of energy oozing to the surface leaves no room for the rapid and deep climate fluctuations that are able to pull the Earth out of deep ice age conditions to near interglacial climates over the span of 3 decades, as evidence indicates has happened. The slow energy oozing from the core of the sun cannot cause the enormously large and rapid climate oscillations that have occurred all the way through the last ice age, named the Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations. These rapid oscillations speak of extremely fast transition events from deep glacial conditions all the way up to near interglacial conditions, and all this compressed into just 3 decades in some cases. Such enormous effects are not possible without an equally enormous cause. The internal fusion sun theory is completely incompatible with this evidence and renders the theory wrong. My video that explores the externally powered sun illustrates that such fluctuations are not only possible, but are completely natural. The video illustrates that the surface fusion process can collapse when the input streams diminish below the minimal level of density that is required for the process to function. The video illustrates further that beyond the collapse point, where the sun goes inactive, we face reduced solar energy radiation. The sun's inactive energy output will likely reflect what we measure today in the umbra of the sunspots. The entire surface of the sun will likely change as rapidly to its inactive state as we see the sunspots opening up at the present stage. The sunspots illustrate how fragile the solar process actually is. When the sunspots open up, it takes a relatively long time for the collapsed areas to heal. The sunspots are highly significant for us to understand with the mind what we see with the eyes. In the case of the sunspots, we see conditions developing that disrupt the fusion process. We see a case before us where the fusion products have clogged up the fusion process, which collapsed the plasma containment system. As the magnetic environment disintegrates, a portion of the clogged up environment blows out, leaving a dark hole in the wake that gradually fills up again from the surrounding areas. The dark sunspots tell us that below the surface of the sun, the entire sun is made of plasma instead of atomic gas. Plasma is invisible. Gas would be visible. What we see is critical because the recognition that it is only possible for the sun to be externally powered also enables the recognition that the sun can be externally interrupted when the magnetic fields collapse that focus plasma onto the sun from interstellar plasma streams. Then, when the shiny layer vanishes, what will we have remaining? The entire sun will become as dark as we presently see it to be through the umbra of the sunspots. That's when the Ice Age begins. This is big. We will have to live in a world that has its solar heat input diminished by a whopping 70% in the space of a day or days. The entire complex of the Ice Age dynamics rests exclusively on the potential for the sun to go inactive, and that this will happen when the input plasma streams diminish below the minimum density that is required for the magnetic fields to form, which focus plasma onto the sun. The cutoff threshold is enormously important for humanity, especially at the present time. Actually, the term important is too weak a term, because the very existence of humanity in the near future depends on the recognition of this critical point. For as long as the sun is deemed to be an atomic gas star, with nuclear fusion occurring inside of it, by which it is deemed to be an invariable constant, the preparations will not be made for life to be able to continue under an inactive sun. And considering that the preparations will take decades to implement, to protect the world's food supply, the question that would enable humanity to start the needed preparations needs to be settled soon. If it isn't settled soon, humanity dooms itself by its inactions. The cutoff point is near. It cannot be avoided. Nor a reactive response is possible. When the transition begins, it is too late to react. It is physically easier to rid the world of the danger of nuclear war because it is known where the bombs are located, which can all be destroyed in a week. Once the decision is made to do so, the Ice Age challenge, however, is not so easily met. Extremely large infrastructures will be required to relocate the world's agriculture out of the Ice Age endangered areas into the tropics. This means placing most of the relocated agriculture afloat onto the equatorial seas, for the lack of available land in the tropics, and to have the floating complexes connected with intercontinental floating bridges. At the same time, 6,000 new cities will have to be built, for 1 million people each, to service the floating agriculture, and to enable the relocation of entire nations out of the areas that become uninhabitable under an inactive sun, with 70% less energy output. As I said before, it will take decades to accomplish the feat, after we decide to start. Since we don't have much time remaining before the Ice Age begins, the critical breakthrough that enables us to start will have to be made now. If this isn't happening, we murder our children by default when the Ice Age begins and kill ourselves with it, those of us who expect to live beyond another 30 years. But how can we be certain that the Ice Age transition will be happening? And will be happening soon? What hard evidence do we have that can jolt us out of the present dreaming of eternal sunshine to the reality before us and impel us to massively upgrade our world on the basis of this evidence? Hard evidence in mass density comparison. Fortunately, it is not hard to determine that the sun is not an internally powered atomic gas sphere, because this dream is not possible in the physical universe. The sun is too light for it to be an atomic gas star. The mass density of the sun is 1,000 times too low in comparison with known atomic gas spheres like Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter, which has double the volume of Saturn, has correspondingly double the mass density, as its greater gravity causes greater compression of its gas. The Sun, however, in this same comparison, with 1,000 times greater volume than Jupiter, has nevertheless nearly the same mass density that Jupiter has. This would not be physically possible if the Sun was an atomic gas sphere. Its mass density would be 1,000 times greater than it is. Of course, an atomic gas sphere of the size of the Sun, provided that a gas sphere of this size can actually exist, which it cannot, would have its atoms crushed by the enormous force of the resulting gravity. This means that the Sun is simply not a sphere of atomic gas. What is not possible, doesn't happen. And with the Sun not being a gas sphere, the fabled fusion of hydrogen into helium in the core of the Sun, by which it is deemed to be powered, is simply not happening. If the Sun isn't a gas sphere, there's nothing there to fuse. These are hard facts. This means that according to its weight, the Sun can only be a sphere of plasma. Plasma strongly resists gravitational compression by means of its built-in electric repulsion. The repelling force is roughly 40 orders of magnitude stronger than gravity. A plasma sphere with the mass density that the Sun is known to have is easily possible. The required ratio of electrons to protons in the plasma is very much possible, even natural. The rather dramatic mass density comparison presented here closes the door on the internally powered Sun theory. The comparison takes away the foundation the theory is built on. It opens the horizon to the externally powered plasma Sun, which, by becoming inactive, opens the door to the gigantic ice age phenomena that are known to have occurred. This in turn imposes the imperative on us that the ice age infrastructures be built. It's as simple as that. Hard evidence in solar wind measurements. The evidence is located in the measurements made in space by NASA's Ulysses satellite. The Ulysses spacecraft was launched into a polar orbit around the Sun from the shuttle Discovery on October 6, 1990. Its mission was, among other objectives, to measure the solar wind pressure around the Sun outside the ecliptic. In order to establish a high polar orbit, the spacecraft was aimed close to Jupiter, in order that Jupiter's large gravitational field would accelerate the spacecraft out of the ecliptic plane to high solar latitudes. The encounter with Jupiter occurred 14 months later, on February 8, 1992. The Ulysses satellite flew 3 orbits around the Sun. The first orbit began when the spacecraft encountered Jupiter. The resulting first orbit was completed 6 years later, in February 1998. The third orbit began 6 years after that, in February 2004. The spacecraft was turned off in August 2008, 4.5 years into the last orbit. What we got back as data from the satellite gives us the first physically measured verification that the Sun is not an internally heated fusion-powered star, but is an electrically powered star, and that its operating environment is presently fast diminishing. Ulysses saw the solar winds diminishing, while the Sun itself remained constant. It measured a 30% reduction of the solar wind pressure over a span of 10 years. That's huge. The entire heliosphere that surrounds the solar system at a distance 100 times the distance of the Earth to the Sun is getting measurably weaker as the result of the diminishing solar wind. By looking deeper into the past, one can notice that the systemic weakening that Ulysses had measured is actually not a new phenomenon. A general weakening had began already more than 3,000 years ago, with ups and downs along the way, according to what we can glean from ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheet. The Ulysses satellite tells us, however, that the weakening has dramatically increased in modern time. NASA's Ulysses satellite has also measured, correspondingly, a 20% increase in galactic radiation. This increase is precisely what one would expect as the result of the weakening of the solar winds. Thus, with 2 measured items of evidence supporting one another, the measurements tell us that the electrodynamic weakening of the solar system is real, and is fast progressing. But why isn't this electric weakening reflected in a weaker Sun itself, when the Sun is electrically powered? Does the paradox disprove the electric Sun theory? No, it doesn't disprove it. It proves it. It adds instead one more item of proof. The proof lies in what the solar wind represents. In electroastrophysics, the solar wind comes to light as a feature of a regulating system that maintains the operation of the Sun at a tightly controlled level of intensity. The solar wind phenomenon may be seen in terms of a tea kettle. The kettle is placed on a stove. The heat is on high. The kettle is venting off steam as it boils. It is elementary in chemistry that it is not possible to heat the water in the kettle to a temperature hotter than the boiling point. If one turns up the flame, the water in the kettle doesn't get hotter. The extra energy is devoted to producing more steam. In the electrodynamics of the cosmic system that powers our sun, the solar wind can be likened to steam being boiled off from a kettle. The solar wind is the excess plasma that the regulating system lets go. The regulating feature keeps the sun at a steady temperature. This means that when the input plasma density around the sun diminishes, only the solar winds diminish, while the sun itself remains constant in its operation. This means that the solar wind pressure can be used as a measure of the effective power density in the supply line that is feeding into the sun at its reactive surface. In this comparison, the solar wind is the steam that flows from the kettle. If one turns the flame up, the kettle boils faster, and a stronger stream of steam comes out of it. If one turns the flame down, a weaker stream of steam results. By turning the flame down still further, one gets to the point when no steam at all is being produced. Should one reduce the flame even more, the water would get colder in the kettle. Below the boiling point, the temperature of the water diminishes with the energy input. This comparison is significant. Ulysses has measured 30% less steam coming from the sun over the span of 10 years. Now, 5 years further down this path, that solar wind pressure is likely reduced by 45% from what it had been in 1992 when the measurement started. 15 years from now, in the 2030 time frame, the steam flow will likely have diminished by a total of 90%. This means that we will have only 10% left then. And still, even at this highly diminished stage, we won't likely see the slightest change in the sun's energy radiation intensity. Only when the input energy drops below the point where solar winds are no longer ejected will the sun itself begin to diminish. This fading would happen progressively from the 2030 time frame onward. The sun would still function at this point, but with a diminished intensity. When we get to this point, the weakening of the input streams would of course continue. This means that we might not have much time left from this point on before the sun becomes inactive completely. When the supply factor gets diminished, the entire plasma-powered system begins to collapse. Hard evidence in electromagnetic dynamic flow geometry. Numerous experiments have been conducted in different locations and by different people in exploring the electromagnetic processes in principle that cause interstellar plasma streams to be focused around the sun, including with some astrophysical examples. While the discovered principles and their potential reflection in large cosmic examples is but a construct of applied theories, real hard evidence does exist that verifies the discovered and theorized principles. The theorized entry channels into the sun by the focused plasma streams have been verified by the Ulysses satellite in the polar regions of the sun, where the dense plasma streams should be located according to the discovered principles in laboratory experiments, which are too dense for the solar wind to penetrate. This means that the Ulysses satellite has provided hard evidence of the existence of the theorized primer fields based on laboratory experiments. Since the magnetic dynamic flow geometry is a function of the intensity of the flow, then, as the flow is diminishing, the resulting geometry reshapes itself accordingly, which affects the dynamic functioning of the system till a threshold is reached when the entire interlock structure can no longer function and vanishes, as if it had never existed. When this happens to the supply system for the sun that powers its reactive system, the sun will necessarily go inactive. It will become a dim star then, that glows by its residual energy and some nuclear decay within it. Hard evidence in the magnetic pole drift. By looking deeper into the past, one can notice that the systemic weakening that Ulysses had measured is actually not a new phenomenon. A general weakening had began already more than 3,000 years ago, with ups and downs along the way, according to what we can glean from ice core samples drilled from the Greenland ice sheet. The Ulysses satellite tells us, however, that the weakening has dramatically increased in modern time. While we did not have Ulysses taking measurements of the solar wind dynamics going back to the 1500s for comparison, it is possible to reconstruct the historic pattern by the effect of the prevailing strength of the primer field's magnetic field modifying the Earth magnetic field. The Earth creates a magnetic field around itself by the dynamo effects. While the mass of the Earth is predominantly electrically neutral, it is pervaded by significant amounts of plasma particles, which carry an electric charge. The Earth spinning on its axis produces a moving electric current by the rotating mechanical effect. Moving electric currents produce an magnetic field. The resulting magnetic field is generated perpendicular to the electric motion, so that the magnetic field becomes thereby aligned along the Earth's spin axis. This means that without external influences, the Earth's magnetic poles would coincide perfectly with the poles of the spin axis, which are the geographic north and south poles. However, the Earth is also subjected to the magnetic field of the primer fields that focus plasma around the Sun. Since the two fields are offset by 23 degrees by the tilt of the spin axis, the primer fields modify the dynamo fields. The strong interaction by the primer fields shifts the effective magnetic pole away from the dynamo pole, the geographic pole. Depending on the strength of the primer fields, the deflection sometimes exceeds 20 degrees. The theoretical maximum deflection would be 23.44 degrees according to the current inclination of the Earth's spin axis relative to the orbital ecliptic plane of the solar system, that is oriented perfectly perpendicular to the primer field's magnetic orientation. The low-latitude location of the magnetic pole, in 1904, tells us that the primer fields were extremely strong at this time, as the deflection of the magnetic pole, away from the dynamo pole, the geographic pole, was only 4 degrees off from the theoretical maximum. The location of the magnetic pole, shown in red, was determined by Canadian expeditions with on-the-ground measurements, magnetometers in hand, to determine the location where the Earth's magnetic field lines were perfectly perpendicular. The marked locations are the epicenter of daily oscillations of the magnetic pole, that shifts over a distance of up to 80 kilometers as the Earth rotates under the primer fields. If the dynamo magnetic field was perfectly symmetrical and perfectly aligned to the Earth's axis, the oscillations would form a complete circle around the globe at the respective latitude. That they don't indicates that the dynamo magnetic field is asymmetric and is more strongly generated under the continents because of the greater absorption of plasma from space by the open land masses. Above the ground, extending into space, the asymmetric anomalies combine, whereby the magnetosphere around the Earth is centered differently. It was centered on the northwest coast of Greenland in 2005, near the 80-degree latitude. In 1904, the on-the-ground measured north-south deflection over Canada had shifted the magnetic North Pole far south to the 70-degree latitude. This strong deflection at the time indicates that the primer fields were strongly dominant at this time. From 1904 on, however, as the electric weakening in the solar system began, the deflection decreased at a constantly accelerating rate. The rate of change is indicated by the spacing of the blue dots that represent 2-year increments. By 2012, the weakening had become so extreme that the magnetic north was deflected by only 4 degrees off the geometric north, while the overall magnetic field of the Earth became correspondingly weaker. It is said that the Earth's magnetic field is the weakest now in hundreds of years. It may be the weakest since accurate measurements were first made. The extreme weakening that is indicated by the 2012 close approximation of the magnetic pole towards the North Pole, which is off the chart here, coincides in time with the big drought conditions that have begun to grip the world from 2012 on. The coincidence of the two indicates that both effects are the result of the same cause, the same electric weakening. In the solar system, The dramatic weakening of the solar winds that the Ulysses spacecraft had measured during the time span of its operation coincides with the weakening of the primer fields that is reflected in the northward shifting of the magnetic North Pole. Here, too, with the two physical measurements supporting one another, the coincidence points to a common cause. However, what the Ulysses mission did not see, due to its short time span, is the accelerating rate of the electric weakening of the solar system that has occurred, which becomes apparent when it is seen in the wider historic time frame. When the weakening trend that is observed in the wide time frame comes to light as an accelerating trend rather than linear trend, and the acceleration continues, then the collapse of the primer fields and the sun going inactive may occur sometime prior to the 2050 time frame. The accelerating trend that has become evident with the pole shift trend renders the linear projections towards the inactive sun, shown here, to be highly conservative. The projection shown here is based on the short window of the Ulysses time frame. This means that the unfolding reality is likely much more critical than is indicated here. It adds to the urgency of humanity beginning to respond to the Ice Age challenge, which may be far more critical than we would like it to be. Hard evidence and dusty analysis of ice samples drilled from the Antarctic ice sheet reveals large dust accumulations in the atmosphere over Antarctica near the end of every glaciation cycle. While the dust phenomena over Antarctica, the most isolated spot on Earth, is not critical at the present, and is not relevant for determining the start of the next ice age, it is nevertheless interesting, as it illustrates the powerful effect that the primer fields have on the operation of the solar system, which becomes apparent dramatically when the primer fields become inactive. The large dust accumulations that are found in the ice on Antarctica typically begin halfway through a glaciation period and extend for tens of thousands of years. The long duration precludes the potential that the dust resulted from volcanic action, nor does any evidence exist for large volcanic actions to have occurred, which would have dramatically raised the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, which did not occur. So, one needs to ask, what then would have caused the dust accumulation in Antarctica that is as far distant from the large land masses on Earth as any place can be? The timing suggests that the dust is extraterrestrial in nature and is related to the missing effect of the primer fields during the glaciation periods that normally have a stabilizing effect on the orbital system of planets and asteroids. The remarkable order among the planets, their near-circular orbits, and their almost perfect geometric spacing with a near-musical scale precision, is not without cause, but is the result of the electromagnetic influence of the primer fields over long periods of time. Measured evidence suggests that the orbits of the planets are actively maintained by the dynamics of the electromagnetic system that shapes the solar system and determines its ecliptic. It is interesting to note that the planets of our solar system orbit at a mere 71% of the escape velocity that would apply for their orbital distance. This fact suggests that the orbits are electromagnetically supported in addition to the mass gravity velocity mechanics. This supporting influence, of course, is not active during most of the span of the long glaciation periods. As a consequence, the orbits will deteriorate, including those of the numerous types of objects in the asteroid belts. When this deterioration extends over tens of thousands of years, it becomes extremely likely that a large number of asteroids enter the Earth's atmosphere and disintegrate there. If such was the case, we would see the asteroid intrusion continue until the primer fields become re-established, and their effect reorders the orbital system. This is precisely the pattern we see indicated in the dust deposits in ice. The dust stops when an interglacial period begins. The evidence that we find in the dust in the Antarctic ice stands as just one more item that illustrates the dynamics of the electric solar system, as nothing else makes any sense for identifying the cause for the numerous observed phenomena. While the dust patterns do not tell how close we are to the start of the next ice age, it does illustrate monumentally the powerful effect that the primer fields have on everything, especially on the Sun and the Earth, and that the periodic collapsing of these fields is equally as dramatic in all respects. Our cause for celebration. Oh yes. Let's celebrate. Indeed, the call for celebration is not a paradox. The new ice age, that could start in 30 years' time, gives us ample cause for celebration. Anything that promises even remotely to jolt us out of the death ritual that we have trapped ourselves into at the present stage offers cause for celebration. The Ice Age Challenge provides this kind of an impetus. The death trap has many aspects, which have one thing in common. They leave in the wake a defeated society. One face of the death trap is nuclear war. We have the equivalent destructive force of 500,000 Hiroshima-type tragedies hanging over our head. No one yet intends to eradicate this gigantic arsenal of death. To the contrary, ever more provocations are fielded against the world's great nations, and cries being heard that nuclear war is a winnable adventure. Another aspect of insanity is the current world depopulation policy of the Western Empire that demands the reduction of humanity from the current 7 billion people living on this planet to less than 1 billion. Towards the depopulation goal, vast quantities of food are being burned in automobiles, which would normally nourish 400 million people. In a world that has committed 1 billion people to chronic starvation, the biofuels food burning is murdering. Conservatively, 100 million people a year with starvation as surely as if they were executed, which amounts to the greatest ever genocide in history, a genocide so immense that it pales Hitler's Holocaust into insignificance. This is a murder spree that everyone in the Western world is actively participating in, who pulls up to the gas pump, feasting on biofuels. The third aspect of insanity is the trap of greed-based tragedies, called economics, such as the imperial monetarism, that is looting the nations, and is wrecking the productive economies, shutting down industries, turning banks into gambling casinos that dwarf the world economy, eliminating healthcare and education except as profit centers, and so on. And those are only the worst examples. If the Ice Age Challenge can begin to bring some measure of sanity into the current house of horrors, then the slightest step forward is worth a celebration. We may indeed get to this point, where a celebration is in order. NASA's Ulysses spacecraft saw a 20% increase in galactic cosmic reflex during its 16 years of its operation, which appears to be beneficial to neurological and cognitive development. This trend of increased neurological nourishment, especially as it is now increasing, may bring some light into the dismal landscape of the world where hope has been waning evermore. It may well be, then, that in the background to this new cosmic ray trend, the kind of leadership will emerge that will shut down the house of horrors and inspire the building of the critical Ice Age infrastructures that are essential for the survival of humanity. Whether we get to this point where we can heartily celebrate the beginning of a new world remains to be seen. Some steps of progress are already visible. Russia, China, and India are coming together as a development bloc of nations, standing in opposition to the looting practice and depopulation goals of empire. And in Europe, France, Germany, and Italy may find themselves pulling out of the EU empire for similar reasons. Whether the world will succeed to free itself from the ancient trap of empire and become free to respond to the Ice Age Challenge will ultimately be a question of humanity's self-development in the years ahead. This development appears to be not latched to time. It typically takes off phenomenally when it becomes latched to truth. And for the movements of truth, no inertia really exists. Once a truth is recognized, centuries of errors can become overturned in a moment. With the Ice Age transition adding some powerful incentives and some neurotic nourishment, who knows what wonders can be achieved in changed perceptions and attitudes in the space of just moments as we move ahead. Of course, nothing along this line is ever automatic. The essential footsteps need to be taken. In fact, they have become exceedingly critical. humanity at the crossroads. Everything that was presented here tells us that humanity stands at the crossroads today. A long time ago I wrote a science fiction novel that explores 4 different civilizations on 4 different planets to explore the crossroads. One civilization didn't survive, another survived tragically, another developed like a star and became a light in the universe, and still another became what the Earth has the power to become right now. Which path we will choose for our future on Earth cannot be foreseen. All paths lay before us. The choice is ours to make. The universe will not make this choice for us. In the novel, the choice is left open. In real life, the choice cannot be omitted. Let us commit ourselves, therefore, to choosing life and a bright future, a future that we are able, as human beings, to create for ourselves with all things considered, that our remarkable humanity, that makes us the brightest stars of life on the planet, can accomplish.